Zainab Rycliffe lived in a house just across the road from where this incident happened, and on the 15th of October 1985, the day of the Trojan Horse incident, her children were younger than 12, two boys and a girl, I think, were playing in the garden in front of her house. This is her testimony. On the 15th October 1985, that day I will never forget. On that day there was a march happening, and I could see that things would go wrong. And the Caspers, these are military trucks, and the police vans started driving up and down the roads. When the children were on their way to the Muslim school, Miss Abrams took their children to a Muslim school, and Miss Abrams returned from Muslim school. I could see that something was going wrong. I invited them into the house, and I closed the door of the house. One of the friends of my children wanted to go home, but I told him not to go home, that he had to stay with me for a while because of the obvious danger outside. He insisted, and I opened the door of the house. As I opened the door of the house, and just after the children went out, they ran back into the house. I waited until all the children were back into the house, and then I locked the door. Then I noted that one of my children and one of my sister's children were still outside, and I panicked. I was also shocked, but I was so concerned about my children, and because Mrs. Abrams was screaming. She said to me, "Please help me, Zainab, please help me." And I said to her, "I can't help you." And then I went out at the back door of the house. I saw my son. I opened the back door, and the child came in. Then I was still missing a child. I noticed my child was sitting in the chicken coop, and the police were walking up and down in the passageway behind the house. My one child choked the chickens so that they would not make a noise because of the police walking up and down with their rifles, and so that they would not notice him. He choked the chickens so that they died, so that they would not make a noise and attract the attention of the police. And then he came into the house. Miss Abrams was still screaming, and then my mother came and said to Miss Abrams to stop screaming. Then this one fat policeman kicked open the door. My sister then said to him, "Don't kick open the door, there are children in the house." When he kicked the door of the house open, I was convinced that he would kill all of us because he came into the house with his rifle. One child was under the dressing table, and the policeman grabbed him, and then I screamed at my sister, "Look, they're taking Ismail." Then we said to him, "The child is too small, leave the child." I then went to the kitchen and saw blood all over the kitchen. My food on my stove and all of the cups and saucers and glasses in the kitchen were broken with the shots that were fired. When Sean ran into the house, he threw himself on my bed. Miss Abrams threw herself on the bed also, and she had blood on her from the children. The children were wearing maroon jerseys, so she did not see the blood. When he fell on my bed, he died, and he died there on my bed. So this was an act of government brutality to these children and teenagers. Now, on the other side, the resistance movements also did things. And the two other bits of testimony I want to tell you about has to do with a particular resistance movement setting landmines on farm roads in the northern part of the country. And so these are two bits of testimony from two men who drove on those roads with their children. The first is a Mr. Johannes Petrus Ruiz. It's not easy for me to come and sit here today. It's not easy for me to express myself and express what happened on the night of 17th of August 1986. We're all but human, and these are things that happened, and we have to live with it. I have to live with it, and I have to support a family and also have my friend's family and the community, and I have to be in contact with them and handle them fairly. Now I will tell you what happened on Sunday, the 17th of August, 1986. My wife, my children, and I went to church that Sunday evening. We were driving in two separate vehicles because earlier the afternoon I had to be at church and they had to join us later. At approximately 8:10, we left the church service to our residence at Stellensrust Estate in Korea, which is approximately 12 kilometers from Nelspruit. My wife and my three children were driving ahead of me, and I was following them in my vehicle. We got to the turnoff of the farm where we turned off from the tarred road to the gravel road. The first section was used by various people at the Korea citrus farm. We went to where the road splits up. In the one direction going towards my private residence, my wife got to the division. She turned towards our house, and you could see the lights at our home. But as my daughter told me a few years later, because she was in the car when the explosion took place, there were three children sitting on the back seat. My son was sitting behind his mother, and my 15-month-old baby was sitting on his sister's lap. She was 5 years old at the time. My wife said to my son who was sitting behind her, "Jackie, here are the house keys. You unlock the door for us." He then leant over from behind her to get the car keys, and at that moment she detonated the landmine. I was driving approximately 20 meters behind them, and I saw everything. I saw the flames underneath the car, and I saw the car being tossed into the air, off the road, onto the left-hand side, into the bushes. Pieces of metal and dust were in the air, and I drove closer, and I jumped out, and I said, "God, why?" I went closer, and I looked at my wife. She was sitting on her seat, and she was covered in dust, and she was severely injured. Her body was covered in blood, and she couldn't feel her legs anymore. She groaned and asked, "Where are my legs?" My son that was standing behind her at that time was sitting on the seat, and his head was to one side, and he was unconscious. My other two children, my baby son was sleeping on his sister's lap at the time. They were so anxious, they were screaming, and she just held him. I took my two children out, put them in my vehicle, and took them to the nearest house where Mr. Pretorius was already preparing to come out. I briefly told him what had happened and asked his wife to look after my two children and asked him to come and help me so that we could get my son and my wife out of the car. He then went with me, and we managed to open the front door of the wreck, and I put my jacket down on the grass and put my wife on top of the jacket. Then we tried to free my child, who was on the back seat, but we could not get him out because the front seat had trapped his legs in between the seat. I then asked my neighbor to please fetch his car and take my wife to the hospital in the meantime. At that time, I got down on my knees and I said to my wife, "Please don't give up hope. Look to God. He will help you. He will get you through this. He will carry you through." And that is how I knelt at her side and asked God to lead us and to give us strength at that time. I was so confused, I didn't know what to do. Mr. Pretorius came, we picked up my wife and put her on the back seat, and he took her away to the hospital. I then turned my child's legs and freed his little legs, and I put him into my vehicle and took him off to the hospital, where he was admitted at the Ferreira Hospital. That night we waited there. My wife came out of theater at 3 o'clock the following morning, and the doctors briefly told us what they had done and what they had observed. They had to amputate her right leg below the knee, and the left leg was severely damaged, and they had to put pins in there. 3 days after the landmine explosion, my wife passed away. On the 20th of August 1986, the hospital called me in just before 10 o'clock. I was at the hospital at 10 o'clock, and I found her where she was covered with a sheet. I went back to the scene of the explosion because I knew that part of my wife from her calf down was in the wreck. We went to see if we could find this in the wreck so that we could bury one part of her with the rest. But unfortunately, we couldn't find anything. What we did find was part of my son's forehead. He had a hole on the left-hand side of his forehead. Part of his brains were on the seat, and I picked it up in a tissue and folded it and went and buried it in my house. Do you know how it feels, Mr. Chairperson? Can you just imagine how it feels to have to find part of your 8-year-old's brain and have to go and bury it? Can you just imagine it? What it does to a person? How can you be human thereafter? So I'll leave it at that. How to be human amidst these stories, I wondered to myself. I remember driving in my little Datsun, 1974 Datsun Coupe, driving the 4 hours down from Johannesburg to Bloemfontein after having interpreted stories like these, and playing cassette tapes of early U2 albums, and raging because of these experiences that these people had had, and not knowing how to be human in the midst of these stories. If I had the technical wherewithal this evening and the time, I would play you a song by Matisyahu, the Jewish Orthodox rapper, Jerusalem. But you can go and find that for yourselves on YouTube. It's a version, a contemporary version, a post-Holocaust version of Psalm 137.